Yeah, thank you very much. I know that when journalists are asked to address these kind of events, they're always supposed to be irreverent, rude, and much more downbeat, so I will be. I don't share, I'm afraid, the previous speaker's analysis of what just happened in Kenya at all. I'm really surprised that he said the IEBC emerged with its reputation intact. For me, it's really in tatters. I mean, I was sitting there in the Boma's Tallying Centre watching this process hit the brakes. There weren't really any convincing explanations ever produced. And there are various worrying things that happened long before we got to election day. And of course, on the day, well, I mean, it started off with the technical problems of the biometric kits and then the electronic transmission. But then in the actual counting, we hit these buffers where the server crashed, and we were told that manual would be the mainstay. It had always been planned, and puzzling halts in the announcements of the elections, election monitors being thrown out of the count, along with people from the Carter Institute, the EU, the AU, the African Union. It really just goes on, the list of concerns, and I don't really need to go into the detail because the Kenyan NGOs, civil society, and the opposition, Raila Odinga, and 9 other parties are challenging the IEBC results, and they are under pressure to produce factual information bearing out what they announced. One of the things that I hold on to as a journalist who has a very simplistic interpretation is that this is a very puzzling result given what the opinion polls were saying before we reached election day. And the opinion polls were staggeringly accurate when it came down to these 5 other votes that were not the presidential votes. So it's sort of strange that they got it so wrong on the presidential vote, which of course is the one that everyone's looking at. So it seems they can do their job in 5 areas, but not on this one area. So for me, this is not a successful election. This is an election, elections don't just happen on election day, and I was puzzled when everyone was saying how magnificent and wonderful it was that the election day itself had been peaceful. Well, the election day last time was peaceful in 2007, and the problems came during the count. And as previous speakers have said, we haven't yet finished that process. We are still in the middle of this election. The Supreme Court, everyone's putting a huge amount of emphasis, rightly so, on the role they are about to play. They have yet to decide whether or not Uhuru Kenyatta, who is only president-elect, is actually going to be president or not. And we certainly can't say this has been even a peaceful election until that decision has been made, announced, and accepted by the population. What you see at the moment is a sense by Court supporters who do account for nearly half the population, even if you go along with the voting population, if you go along with the results that were announced by the IBC, they're waiting, and they feel completely excluded from this new government that is likely to form because of the way that the ethnic voting patterns of Kenya have worked, and a long tradition of winner takes all in Kenya. So as a Kenyan journalist said to me shortly before I left, he said, a lot of people in Kenya at the moment are saying, I don't know what the smell is, but it does stink. So there is a very uneasy sense of what happened there, and I think complacency is not in order. Just a few points I'd like to make. Technical fixes, I think this applies to Kenya and Ghana. I think there has been a tendency to try and replace the workings of democracy with high technology in both of these countries. My taxi driver, who I have long discussions with, as all journalists do, at one stage revealed that he thought that all countries in the West used biometric voting and electronic transmission of results. And I said, no, we don't do that. And he said, well, why don't you? Because such has been the narrative in Kenya, where this is presented as being the answer to rigging, the answer to tampering, these high-tech solutions. Well, we don't have it here, I would say, because there's more buy-in into the democratic process. But the point is that system failed on every front in Kenya. I believe that it failed on many fronts in Ghana, but that wasn't quite as striking as in Kenya, where every single step of the way had problems. And the system should have been introduced earlier. They should have been comprehensively tested. People should have been better trained. There was a huge question marks over the procurement process. It seems that a certain amount of eating took place during that process. So if you introduce high-tech systems at the last moment and you don't train anyone how to use them, no, they can't replace democracy and they can't replace buy-in. The final point I suppose I would make now, I have just two more points. One is I think the donors, the Western donors, became in Kenya co-opted in this IEBC process, and there has been a tendency for everyone, from election monitors to Western embassies, to give this the seal of approval this election, because they supported the process so extravagantly. It was $100 million of donor money went into that process, huge amount of technical expertise and advice and help, last-minute help. There was increasing anxiety by Western embassies and what they saw, this unraveling process in the days before the vote. And they were trying to help with sort of building ballot booths and providing solar lighting so that the voting could go late onto the night. And what that buy-in meant was that when it began to go wrong, I think they were very reluctant. There's an inbuilt tendency not to knock something if you have been part of trying to sustain it and support it. So that level of involvement, and it seems that in Ghana they also were heavily invested, does mean that you are then handicapped and sort of emasculated in terms of criticizing the final result. I think finally I'd just like to say that this Kenyan election does pose all sorts of problems for the future. So far we have Raila Odinga saying, I'm going to, I've sworn to uphold the process, go to the courts have got new integrity, and we'll go through this constitutional process of challenging this result. In a way, he's being outmaneuvered. What you're seeing in Kenya is you're seeing Uhuru and Ruto, who are setting up their shadow government. They're deciding who they want to be in government. They are having their security briefings. This is effectively, a series of facts on the grounds are being established, which will make it enormously difficult for any Supreme Court to unravel what has happened. And I think the message that sends out for future elections is very worrying, because what it will say to people who feel that they are watching an election being tampered with, being rigged, results being altered, and this, whether it's true or not, they will feel that there isn't much point going down the constitutional path and going to the courts, because you will be overtaken by events within the first day. And before you know it, there's basically a government in power, and you've lost the election yet again. And I think that's a very worrying message to be sending out. So I can understand why the emphasis and the pressure on Cord and Raila has been, play the constitutional game, abide by the law, but there could be a reading that will be very negative in 5 years to come when we have another election.
All right. Thank you very much indeed.